In the streets of Athens, where the brightest minds once walked, there was a different side to life, a side few spoke of. Yet it shaped the lives of the people in ways they could never forget. It was the time when the people did not just fear punishment, they feared the way it could unfold in front of their eyes in the very public square where they gathered for daily life. Poisoning, a silent but deadly form of execution. The Greeks did not just use poison on the common criminals. They used it on their enemies, their rivals, and even on those they deemed a threat to the state or the gods themselves. Poisoning was often seen as a tool for those who wanted to maintain power without drawing too much attention to the act of killing. It was the perfect weapon for the political arena. A swift, quiet strike that could end a life without a sound, leaving no trace except for the victim's fading breath. One of the most notable uses of poisoning came with the death of the philosopher Socrates in 399 BC. He was not a criminal in the traditional sense. No, Socrates was a man of ideas, an intellectual who challenged the norms, who dared to question the very foundations of society. His beliefs were radical, his methods unorthodox, and his influence over the youth of Athens was growing. For some, that was far too much. Socrates' trial was a spectacle in itself. Charged with impiety and corrupting the youth, he was sentenced to death, but it was not the kind of execution one might expect for a man whose ideas shook the very fabric of Athenian society. No, Socrates was not killed with a sword or left to rot in a prison cell. Instead, he was sentenced to drink a cup of hemlock, a powerful poison known for its ability to paralyze and suffocate its victim. As Socrates calmly drank the hemlock, he talked with his friends. His body slowly became numb, his vision blurred, and his breath grew more labored. The poison worked slowly but efficiently. And in the end, Socrates died, not in the violent way one might imagine for a condemned man, but in a quiet, almost peaceful manner, surrounded by those who loved him and admired his intellect. The use of poison was not reserved for philosophers like Socrates. It was a common tool for political figures as well. In the intricate world of ancient Greek politics, where betrayal was often lurking in the shadows, poison was the perfect method for eliminating an adversary without the risk of a bloody confrontation. Leaders, generals, and even ordinary citizens could find themselves the victims of this silent weapon, especially when power was at stake. One notable case was the poisoning of King Philip II of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father. While the details of his death remain shrouded in mystery, many historians suspect that poison played a role in his assassination. Some believe he was poisoned by political enemies. Others argue that his own family may have been involved. Regardless of who was behind it, the fact remains that poison was the method, quiet, deadly, and undetectable until it was too late. And then there were the women, royalty, wives, daughters, who often found themselves caught in the webs of political dominations. Poisoning was a tool that could be wielded by anyone with the right knowledge. It was said that the infamous Empress Olivia Drusilla of Rome, who was influenced by Greek practices, used poison to eliminate rivals and even potential threats to her power. While her story belongs more to the Roman Empire, the use of poison as a political weapon had its roots deeply embedded in the ancient Greek world. But it was not just the rich and powerful who used poison. There were instances of ordinary criminals, slaves, and enemies of the state being executed with the same quiet cruelty. Poison was, after all, easy to acquire and easy to use, particularly for those who had access to the knowledge of herbs, toxins, and the art of concocting deadly mixtures. Death by wild animals, the ultimate punishment. In the ancient Greek world, death could be as untamed as the wild beasts that prowled the forests. For those sentenced to die, one of the most horrific fates imaginable was being thrown to wild animals. It was a punishment that combined physical terror with psychological horror, where victims were not only condemned to die, but to face an agonizing, brutal end in front of a jeering crowd. It was an execution method that left no room for mercy, and the cruelty was unmatched by anything the human mind could devise. The practice of throwing criminals into the arena with wild beasts can be traced back to the ancient Greek period, though it became more infamous in the Roman Empire. However, the Greeks set the stage for this deadly spectacle. It was a form of punishment meant to serve multiple purposes. First, it was a way to rid society of those deemed dangerous or corrupt. And second, it was a display of the state's power, using nature's most ferocious creatures as instruments of death. Wild animals, including lions, tigers, and bears, were captured and trained for these executions, turned into living weapons used to destroy the condemned. The method was not just about death. It was about spectacle, humiliation, and terror. Victims were often left to die slowly, mauled to pieces, while the crowd looked on in horror and fascination. The very idea of such a death created an atmosphere of fear and dread. The most famous recorded instance of death by wild animals in ancient Greece involves the tragic death of the philosopher and military leader Anaxarchus. Anaxarchus was a well-known figure in his time, a philosopher who famously criticized the ruling powers of his era. His fate, however, would not be one remembered for his wisdom or influence. Instead, he was captured by his enemies, and rather than face a quick execution, he was thrown into a pit to be torn apart by dogs. The image of a respected philosopher reduced to nothing more than prey struck fear into the hearts of those who dared to challenge the status quo. But Anaxarchus was not the only one to face such a gruesome end. Slaves, criminals, and political enemies alike were often condemned to die by wild animals, especially if they were seen as a threat to the rulers or the very order of Greek society. The animals used for these executions were not just ordinary creatures. They were symbols of nature's uncontrollable and deadly forces. They embodied the raw, untamed destruction that awaited those who dared break the laws. One of the most chilling aspects of this execution method was its public nature. It was not just the condemned who experienced fear. It was everyone who witnessed it. The ancient Greeks loved public spectacles, but this was unlike any other. As these animals tore into their prey, the crowd would react with a mixture of awe, fear, and even excitement at you. It was a brutal reminder of the natural world's savage power and how the state could wield it without hesitation. The spectacle of wild animal executions was also tied to the concept of justice being served by the gods. It was believed that the gods themselves controlled the natural world, and by sending animals to execute the condemned, the state was seen as enacting divine punishment. It was a chilling connection between the human world and the wild, a reminder that no one was truly safe from the whims of fate or the wrath of nature. What made these executions so terrifying was the unpredictability. A condemned person could only hope that the beasts would end their life quickly, but most often the outcome was far worse. Being torn apart by lions or bears was a slow, painful process. The victim was often ripped to pieces before they even had a chance to fully understand the horror of what was happening. It was a fate that left a mark on anyone who saw it, one that lasted long after the animals had been led away. In a society that valued itself on deep thinking, democracy, and artistic work, these executions were a dark reminder of the ancient Greeks' belief in the importance of keeping order, no matter the cost. Wild animals were not just tools of death. They were a show of the lengths the state would go to in keeping power and how they would use nature's raw power to prove their control. In ancient Greece, stoning was one of the hardest forms of execution. It was not carried out by a single executioner. Instead, it was the entire community that took part. Men, women, sometimes even children would gather to throw stones at the condemned until they died. Stoning was usually used for crimes that society saw as a direct attack on its values. Disrespect of gods, betrayal, adultery. These were not just personal failures. They were seen as illnesses that could spread if not destroyed quickly. The punishment had to be public. It had to send a message. No one was above the laws of the city. The process itself was cruel and slow. A person could survive the first few stones. It was not a single hit that ended their life. It was dozens, sometimes hundreds of hits. Bones would break. Skin would tear. Breathing would become impossible. Death usually came from inside bleeding, head injury, or suffocation under a pile of stones. There were often rules. In some cities, the first stone had to be thrown by the person who blamed them. This was meant to stop false blaming. If you wanted someone condemned, you had to take personal responsibility for their death. Stoning was not just about punishment. It was about shame. To die by stoning meant that your community had rejected you so fully that they were ready to destroy you with their own hands. It was not a quiet death. It was not respectful. It was public, dirty, and disgraceful. In some cases, after death, the body was left where it fell as a warning to others. In others, it was buried under the same stones that killed it, as if to remove the memory of the person fully. Stoning was a way for society to protect itself, but it also showed the darkest sides of human nature: fear, anger, and the need to blame. In ancient Greece, crucifixion was rare, but when it was used, it gave a strong message. It was a punishment saved for the worst offenders, runaway slaves, traitors, and enemies of the state. Crucifixion was not just about killing a person. It was about insulting them in front of everyone. The process started with public showing. The condemned would often be stripped of their clothes, tied or nailed to a wooden post or cross. There was no hiding. The person was left hanging, often outside the city gates where everyone passing by could see their pain. Unlike other forms of execution, crucifixion did not kill quickly. The body would weaken over hours, sometimes days. Breathing became harder as the weight of the body pulled down on the lungs. Muscles cramped. Blood movement slowed. Death usually came from tiredness, suffocation, or heart failure. In some cases, soldiers would break the legs of the condemned to make death faster. Without the ability to push up and breathe, the person would suffocate faster. But often they were simply left to die slowly under the open sky. The goal was clear: to destroy not just the person's body, but their respect. To take away everything's strength, honor, and even humanity. And to make sure that everyone who saw it understood the cost of breaking the city's laws. For the Greeks, honor in death was important. Dying by crucifixion removed that honor fully. It turned a death that could have been private and peaceful into a slow, painful public warning. While crucifixion became more common and fixed under Roman rule, the Greeks used it when they wanted to give an example that no one would forget. It was not justice in the way we think of it today. It was fear, plain and simple. Fear that kept society in line. Music, execution methods like these were never just about punishment. They were tools used by ancient societies to protect themselves, to control fear, and to enforce loyalty. But they also showed something uncomfortable: how far people are willing to go when they believe their world is under threat. Today, these methods are remembered not as examples of justice, but as reminders of how easily cruelty can be accepted when it wears the mask of law. The stones that once broke bones and the crosses that once broke spirits now stand in history as warnings of what happens when punishment becomes show. And when the value of a human life is decided by the crowd, though centuries have passed, the questions remain. What does justice mean? And how easily can it turn into something much darker?